Well, we had to rework the cart a little bit. Well, my screw-driven press brake on the metal forming cart worked just fine as long as I had 2-inch wide angle iron, but the first time I tried to use it on 1-inch wide, it just failed completely. So we're going to have to rework that. Another thing is the shear normally comes with a 6-foot tall bar, and that's why it's normally mounted down low, so I moved that. But today we're going to focus on a new bending arrangement, one that's more like the original Roper-Whitney style. And the original was basically a vise with a big bending lever on one side that looked like it might have been on a bearing. We'll see how that evolves as the project goes along. I think we'll begin by just removing all of this. Bring this right back down to the bare tabletop. Okay, I'm back to a blank slate. Now, what are we going to use for a vise? So if we go back to the time I scrapped out that giant jointer at S.A.S.E Building Products, and I'll leave a card up in the corner to when I did that, this is one of the things that I took off that piece of machinery, and this is a lot like half of a vise jaw. So I think this is what we'll use for a clamping force. Using the flap disc and the bench grinder, I turn this down to a diameter of 1/2 inch. It's going to be a plain bearing basically, and that will ride inside the movable jaw of our vise. Okay, so this piece of channeled steel here should work just fine for my stationary jaw. I'll weld some gussets in there and we'll weld that to the table. Now to make the fixed jaw, we'll take another piece of that 1-inch plate like we did in the last iteration and just cut it. Okay, here's what I've come up with for my vise. Now all I need is the bender part. Here I'm reaming a piece of 1/2 inch black iron pipe out to 5/8 of an inch on the inside. That will become the pivot point, and we'll just use a 5/8 inch bolt passing through the tabletop as the axle. Now we'll just cut this to length and we'll build on a handle and an interface to the angle iron. Okay, now there are a couple of things that have to happen here. We've got our axis, this bolt, and mounting that to the table is not going to be a problem. Just drill a hole and we'll weld a nut on the underside of the table. We'll screw it in and put a jam nut on it. So this tube is the part that's going to turn, but the tube alone is not going to do the job. It needs to have a couple of aspects to it. One is a receiver for the bending bar, and then the other is going to be a plate that's going to press against the angle and move it. Here I'm welding up a couple of pieces of angle iron with a couple of shims and the bending bar in it. That should give us enough clearance. Then we'll weld that onto the pivot point. Okay, so here's my pivot. Here's my receptacle for the bending bar, and that's going to go on the pivot. Then there's this little hinge, and the reason you have this hinge here is because depending on the thickness of the angle you're bending, the angle relative to the vise has to be able to change. And I think this hinge that I made is just too bulky. Okay, here's what I've come up with, and I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to round off these 2 edges on this side and round off those 4 edges on this side. That way I'll get a little bit of movement, and I don't really need a lot of movement out of this thing. Okay, so you see what I've done here is I've rounded off the 2 sides and I've rounded off the other side of the middle piece. Now, if we weld these together, look, that is plenty of pivot and no binding. That's good. Okay, that's looking good. Now let's take it apart and weld it. I can live with that. I think I'll just cut this bar off and peen it over on the ends and lock that into place. Alright, so here's the vise mocked up on the table here, but I don't think we're going to do this. I don't think I want to install the fixed jaw yet, but I do want to install the moving jaw. So we'll get all this other stuff out of the way here. Okay, now the reason I did this thing with these extra pieces in here is because I want to make sure that I can remove this jaw. And I can, that's good. And I don't want a bunch of weld spatter on my shear, so I'll just cover that up with my fireproof cloth. One thing I did not get right, this knob is too big. It sticks up above the top of the vise. So you can't use the top of the vise as your locator to make sure you have a flat, square bend. It kind of sucks that beautiful knob is not going to work out, so I guess I'm going to have to just cut off the knurled section, grind it round, and then drill a hole through it for a rod. Okay, so I drilled that to accept a 3/8 inch rod, and I'll make something for it at some point. Let's try this again. Well, I'd be happy with that if it worked a little bit better. Adding some lubrication definitely helps. I will be trying some things to see if I can get the performance to improve. But it's a lot better than the screw-driven press brake that I had in there before. Anyway, that's all for this time. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. Click up here to see my last video. Click over here to see something of mine that YouTube thinks you'll like. Please be safe during this pandemic and have a good one.